environmental testing and facilities consulting. ECS operates in 65 locations in the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and Southwest. Not only is ECS one of our sponsors for the Realtors Commercial Alliance of Greensboro, but it is also the official education sponsor for CCIM in North Carolina. So we thank you for that. Brian Moss has been working with ECS for 25 years and has been the Director of Business Development since 2014. John Lear started his career with ECS in 1998, and he has been a Director of Environmental Services since 2013. These two gentlemen will be speaking with us today about environmental impacts on commercial real estate, and will also be giving us insight into how COVID-19 has impacted the workplace in 2020. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian and John.
All right.
All right, I'm going to turn. Bear with us.
Yep. All right, I think we're there. Well, it's good to be here with everybody today. I'm Brian Moss. I have worked in the triad market for 30 years and been part of ECS for 25. So the commercial real estate industry has been very good to our company over the years, and we feel that we need to step up and sponsor, and we do that every year. So thank you for being here today. I was supposed to present to you, if you might recall, St. Patrick's Day. It was going to be an evening event, and then we were going to flow into a social happy hour. Well, that didn't happen, and so here we are today. But just real quick.
Let's see, sorry about that. We may need to.
Okay. All right, so just real quick, our core services are geotechnical. That's your soil borings on construction sites for new buildings, for additions, expansions, construction materials testing, facilities, which are property condition assessments and building envelope and mold and moisture problems. But today we're going to be talking about environmental services. So you mentioned that we've got 65 offices, 2,000 employees, 30 years, and I've been with us for 25 of those 30. And we just cracked the top 70 design firms in the country, and probably in the Southeast, we're probably the largest of our type of firm. I was asked to provide kind of a market overview, which you might find interesting coming from an environmental consultant, but when we were talking to the board of directors, you know, it was kind of, we are a bit of a barometer to how the market is looking, primarily because the type of services that we offer with environmental and geotechnical, we're generally the first people on a site. Everybody generally, if they're looking at a project, needs a loan for an environmental assessment. They might need some soil borings done if they're planning to build. So we are a bit of a barometer to how things are acting and responding in the market. I will also say that every one of our projects in the 25 years that I've been here in the triad, we geocode those locations. We track it with a sector, so we know instantly the data that we can review and know how we're doing in different markets, in different sectors, even in different cities, you know, where our strengths, where our weaknesses are. But I would say pre-COVID, that going back to February 2020, we were generally busy. This is from the eyes of ECS here in the Piedmont Triad. So I'm not really talking about Raleigh or Charlotte or other ECS offices. This is a bit triad focused, but we were pretty busy in all sectors, especially healthcare, industrial, higher education. And then I would say mid-March, a lot of it slowed down. A lot of our new construction projects that were planned to come out of the ground were in decline. They were delayed. Projects planned to start in spring were delayed, canceled, or postponed. And and we survived internally with the workload that we had, but it was certainly not a robust second quarter by all means. And then we noticed coming out in probably July, late June, July, things started to ease up a little bit, and we saw a lot of real estate transactions start to come back. Money is still low. Interest rates are still low. There's some values out there. So we saw the phase ones and the subsurface valuations and the property condition assessments all start to come back. Oh, not quite to 2019 levels, but certainly better than we were doing in the second quarter. And then as we noticed, industrial distribution, advanced manufacturing, that stayed up. Multifamily and single family, especially for the Triad area tract builders, I think it is related to population migration, people wanting to leave the big metropolitan cities in the Northeast and maybe the Midwest, move down here. We are seeing tract builders that we work with is very busy. Smaller retail was coming back strong, really the dollar stores, fast food, car washes, oil changes, they were still going, as well as Walmarts and your grocery stores. They were still very active. Assisted living crashed. I will say everybody put an assisted living project on hold, but we saw 3 or 4 come out of the ground just here in the Triad, starting the next, heading into the fall. And if you're not aware, this is from the North Carolina Economic Development Partnership. We are the #1 retiree state destination. So you can will see population migration coming to North Carolina just because of our climate and the mountains and the coast that we have here. It's a great place to live. So sectors, just real quick, manufacturing is up, commercial is up. I'd say healthcare, pretty much, they put everything on hold, just dealing with the coronavirus, COVID-19. Senior living, everything was paused, especially interior renovations. They didn't want contractors coming in, but we're seeing senior living start to come back. I'd say urban mixed use, at least in the Triad. Now, Charlotte and Raleigh are still gangbusters. Those offices are still wide open with urban mixed use projects. I'd say the Triad took a dip, and I haven't really seen it come roaring back yet, but multifamily is up. The education sectors, both K through 12 and higher education, they kind of took a nosedive, especially private universities. But single family tract builders are up. I'd say state and local government are down. But that's kind of a quick summary of the market. In 2019, ECS had a record year company-wide, and here in the Triad, we had a record year as well. We're certainly off the pace from 2019, but we believe that we're going to finish out the year strong just with the activity we've seen in these different market sectors, and hopefully you and your industry are starting to see similar opportunities. Tim asked me to touch base on COVID-19. Now, keep in mind, this is ever evolving. So, we at ECS have to respond and react just like everybody else. We have employees that we have to protect. When the restrictions came in, ECS, we had to keep going. We were considered an essential business because we support the construction industry. So our engineers, our scientists, our geologists, our field techs, we were still out there on construction sites just like everybody else, trying to figure it out day to day, week to week, based on the guidance that we were getting from CDC and OSHA. And that's where we as a company have to take our guidance, is OSHA and primarily how to protect our workers, because we're the Department of Labor is basically our governing body. And so that's the data that we came up with. But just real quick background, it's a coronavirus. It's a form of SARS, but it came back much stronger with a lot more resistance and able to transmit from person to person. It's mainly through respiratory droplets. It's good to see that some of the research that's been done, the surface transmission is a lot less. So that's where if you wash your hands and do a pretty good job of using soap and water or hand sanitizers, you can limit the surface transmission pretty good. So most of the transmission that they found is through respiratory droplets when people cough or people sneeze, and then you kind of walk into that breathing zone. And then the virus viability, a couple hours to up to 3 days. I think when you're dealing with heat in summer and ultraviolet radiation, I think it keeps it in check pretty well. I am pretty active, so I do know one way to fight COVID is to get out there. So if you like to play golf, if you like to get out and walk, if you've got an active lifestyle, one way to fight it is hit the outdoors and let the ultraviolet rays do their job. It really can help. Symptoms, mainly a fever, cough, dry, repetitive cough, fatigue, shortness of breath. You don't get the runny nose like you typically would with a flu. It has an incubation period of 2 to 14 days, and roughly 20 to 50% of your COVID cases are asymptomatic. They don't even know that they have it until they get tested, which is interesting to try and combat this and fight this. As I mentioned, we are governed by OSHA, and OSHA considers COVID-19 a workplace hazard under the General Duty Clause. So, smaller firms may not be obligated under OSHA, but ECS and a lot of firms that we work for are. So we had to quickly develop some preparedness and response programs that included potential sources, which are basically your high touch areas, who are your high risk individuals, non-occupational risk factors, some of your controls. Obviously, people started to go to flexible work sites or working off hours or working from home, trying to discourage communal supplies. So everybody went into quickly identification and isolation. Most companies had to self-monitor and educate their employees. And then if needed, additional engineering controls for close contact. So that's when you went into your grocery store, your retail store, and all of a sudden there's plexiglass dividers in front of you at the checkout counter. That's additional engineering controls if you can't maintain a social distance in the environment. One thing, just so you know, understanding the differences between a surgical mask and an N95 respirator. N95 is truly the respirator that if you're worried about catching the coronavirus is ultimately the best protection out there. And I know there's a lot of different information about masks, but the N95 is designed to catch microorganisms like COVID-19, like mold, like different allergens, things like that. A surgical mask helps. I don't want to downplay that. It helps because it does catch the water droplets, the respiratory droplets that you may exhale if you cough and don't know that you have it. It also helps. It doesn't completely eliminate the smaller coronavirus molecules, but it does help to capture some of the bigger droplets, but there's no fit testing for it. It's just a different application. But when you hear about differences in the media and differences in technologies, just know N95 for your personal protection is a better respirator if you're able to get your hands on that. Surgical mask is great if you use it with social distancing, but it's not foolproof when you're using that. So what CDC, EPA guidelines are for cleaning and disinfecting. And I think early on in March, April, a lot of us were still trying to figure out what's the best approach. But now sanitizing versus disinfecting. One thing you need to know is that there's a lot of products out there. And some products, say, reduce the potential for viruses like coronavirus and other viruses that are used, they say reduced. Others say disinfect, kills. There is a difference. The EPA put out an end list of the different compounds that kill mold and kill coronavirus versus may reduce the risk. Now, early on, it was very difficult to get a lot of these products. They were in short supply, so everybody did the best that they could, but just recognize that. So we used a product, BioEsk, EPA approved, it kills. It's a botanical-based product. It smells like lemongrass when you use it. We use it for touch surfaces. We use it for fogging and cleaning. Just know that there's personal protective equipment that you should be wearing, a mask and gloves and things like that. But the main thing is understanding the difference there. Develop a plan for your business. Clean and disinfect your high contact surfaces. Make sure you've got your hazard communication in line. Make sure that you've got your approved list of disinfectants, but I would stick to the EPA list. That's all available online. We could email that to the association if you'd like after this, and then use safe disinfectants to the extent that you can, and then disinfecting of frequently touched surfaces daily. So obviously our cleaning crews that come in our work, like yours, probably they just had to take a little bit of time to get educated on the right products. We work with them on the products that we'd like them to use. And every night we do that. And then throughout the day, our employees, as they come in, they kind of clean and disinfect. We frequently wash. We use masks in common areas. And, you know, it seems to help, at least within the view of ECS, it seems to have helped. And believe me, we have a lot of people that cover construction sites daily. So I'm pretty pleased overall with the responsiveness of our company to handle this. There are different methods of dealing with it. Now, when I say testing, I mean ventilation testing. One of the keys to controlling COVID-19 is having good fresh air, fresh ventilation in your buildings. And, you know, ECS provides services to look at that, but there are many companies out there that can do that, including mechanical engineers, mechanical contractors. But you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your fresh air intakes, your outside air intakes. That can be a challenge when it's 90 degrees outside and humid, and you don't want to bring in humid air, and then you've got to be careful. But, you know, testing and balancing and make sure you got good ventilation is critical. Have an emergency action plan that your company can rely on. Now you're probably starting to read where there's some wastewater testing going on at different universities to test dorms to see if there's a potential issue. And the bones of COVID are often found in wastewater. So you can sample wastewater, which is kind of gross. It's a lunchtime, you know, meeting for those of you that are eating right now, but it is a good way to track it. And some universities have used it to kind of isolate dorms on their campus to make sure that they won't have an outbreak. And then making sure that if you do have a COVID situation, gets immediately handled by some trained individuals, gets cleaned up, gets fogged, whatever you can do to kind of minimize your exposure and get your employees back to work. That's the key. And then just be upfront. You have to communicate in this world. You've got to let employees know what's going on. If there's an outbreak, you don't have to name a name under the HIPAA laws. You don't want to violate that, but you do have to be upfront with your employees if you do have an outbreak in your office, so that everybody can deal with it and manage it. And there's different ways to deal with that if anybody wants to talk offline. But with that, I'm going to turn over the rest of the program to John Lair. He's going to talk more about your traditional environmental services. We can, if we need to revisit some questions at the end about COVID-19, I'm happy to do that with you. So John, I'm going to turn it over.
Greetings all. Take this down and stop my fog from happening. Okay, very good. Well, welcome all. Again, my name is John Lair. I'm the Director of Environmental Services for ECS Southeast. That territory, for lack of a better word, covers the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. We have plus or minus 75 environmental professionals across that territory, a majority of which are here in North Carolina. I started my career in this marketplace. I started in Greensboro in 1995, joined ECS. Brian Moss was my boss for many of those years. Spent 10 years working in this marketplace, evaluating real estate. Phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments was my area of expertise. I want to pile on a little bit of what Brian said about the market research or the market sector activity. I look at a very large footprint. I see the goings on of our business, our environmental due diligence business, around the whole region. We have a monthly meeting about this, about what we're seeing in the marketplace. And what I see is generally what the local office manager, the local business development folks are seeing. So as you would expect down on the coast, we have a lot of hospitality, a lot of retirement type construction and activity. In the triad, it's more industrial, light industrial type work. So, you know, depending on where you are is what we're seeing. I will pile on that the market is, for environmental due diligence, commercial real estate is hot. I'll say that across the Southeast. Phase 1 ESAs are booming right now. It's one thing to get under contract. It's another thing to close a deal. And that's where you guys come into play, right? Making those things happen. So, my goal today is to talk a little bit about the core services we really provide with the commercial real estate industry. The ubiquitous phase 1 ESA. I'm certain everybody has experienced one of these products before. We're just going to touch base on some of the highlights of them. We are currently operating under the 152713 standard. The ASTM updates that standard roughly every 5 years. It's been a long time overdue on updating the new one. It looks like probably 2021 was when the new standard will come out. But the intent of this, of course, is more than just my lender is making me, right? The lender is making property purchasers or investors do phase 1 ESAs because they're trying to protect their collateral, which should be an indication of why of the importance of the product. Its intent is to provide a due diligence, to provide a legal defense to potential liability associated with contaminants that may impact soil, groundwater, or soil gas / vapor from sources that are currently there, historically there on the property, or have migrated beneath the property from offsite sources. Okay, so that's our job in the industry as environmental consultants, to go out there and evaluate the real estate. The shelf life of these products are a year. Okay, if there's a delay in closing, there are certain aspects of the report, for it to remain viable, have to be updated if they're greater than 6 months old and less than a year old. Okay, so there's things from property owner interviews to user questionnaires to site reconnaissance, to name a few. So if there's a delay in closing, those are things to certainly consider. Certainly, there's some frequently asked questions. How much is this product, right? I would think it's not just an ECS standard. I would say it's an industry standard. You're seeing prices there between $1,900 and $2,500. Really, it depends on how big's the site, how close is it to the professional's office, because everything else is about the same. I wouldn't dumb it down to say it's a checklist, because it's more than that. There's professional judgment that goes into interpreting the data that we'll talk about here on. So the turnaround typically is 2 to 3 weeks, but we're seeing in the industry right now, we're pushing a week to 2 weeks. And that's provided that we have full access to the site and all the necessary information, but moving at that pace is really what's critical. And then of course, report reliance. It's not uncommon for the entity that engages us to maybe form a new LLC before they close on the real estate, before they close on their loan. So it's not uncommon for us to be asked to provide reliance, extending the liability, extending, excuse me, the work product to that entity or to their lenders. Okay, so that's typically what we'll do there. Some of the non-scope items to consider. So ASTM is very clear on what a phase 1 ESA includes, and it's very clear on what it does not. Some lenders will go above and beyond the ASTM standard on their requirements. So it's good to know and make sure that your client understands, they don't often know, maybe they're shopping lenders. They may not know exactly what lender they're using at the time. So it's good to go in with at least the ASTM standard. And keep in mind that depending on the lender, it's a good thing to ask, what other services above and beyond the standard will they require? Some want us to look at asbestos containing materials, lead-based paint, mold, PCBs, etc. Some of the hazardous materials. And that's for existing sites. For undeveloped sites, of course, we're looking at wetlands, cultural resources like old cemeteries or Native American burial grounds to threatened endangered species. Some of the things that in our industry, from our perspective, that can make or break a deal is lots of contamination on the site, shallow rock, shallow groundwater, creating development challenges, or wetlands. You might have a nice 20-acre piece of land that 18 acres of it's wetlands, and so you got 2 acres of usable dirt to build with. So those are some of the things that we get involved in during the due diligence phase. Okay, vapors. For some of us that have been dealing in this industry for a while and think they know everything, they've been a little frustrated about the vapor intrusion component of phase 1s. It came alive, so to speak. It came into the industry practice in the 2013 standard. And basically, it's another contaminant media that has the potential to impact your property, okay? So normally, historically, we've always looked at potential for contamination to soil or groundwater, and how that may impact public health and liability. One of the things that started coming into, as the industry moved forward, lenders started getting comfortable with known soil and groundwater contaminants on sites because of things that Brian Moss described earlier, engineering controls. Right. So, I've got contamination, but it's 5 feet down. What does that matter? I'm on city water and sewer. What does that matter? Well, the reality is there's more than just these contaminants out there. And now the bigger concern is this vapor intrusion. Vapor intrusion has the ability to come into your building and impact your occupants. So it starts becoming an OSHA issue as well as potential a risk for liability. And I'm going to have another slide here. So what we do in the phase 1 ESA is to look for potential. When we talk about recognized environmental conditions, we're also looking on whether that is vapor intrusion from on-site or off-site sources, either current or historic. So yes, we want to take, the environmental professional wants to take into consideration and point out in our report if there's a potential for impact to the site. And so we're going to make a comment. We may not have any concerns with soil or groundwater, but we may have concerns with potential vapor intrusion. So what is vapor intrusion? What's the real problem? What's the source? Well, this is a really good illustration of the types of things that we deal with in the phase 1 ESA. Over here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. There's an above ground storage tank here. We've got maybe some underground sources, and it's going to leak. Now these sources leak, they're going to migrate downward, okay, and they're going to hit this zone of groundwater. And if you see this arrow here, that's the direction of groundwater flow. And traditionally, as scientists and engineers and geologists, we are looking at where's the direction that this contaminant's flowing, right? Which way is that going? Because if I'm evaluating sources of contamination that it may impact my site from off-site, I try to want to get a spatial understanding of the topography so I can rule in or rule out sources. Well, with groundwater, you're dealing with gravity, right? Groundwater wants to follow, water wants to follow and find sea level. That's what with gravity, it's going to flow that direction. With vapors, this is what you see when you're driving down that. You can picture yourself driving down the interstate out in Arizona, and you can see the haze coming off the asphalt pavement. If you're pumping gas and it's hot outside, you can see the haze coming out of the nozzle and out of your gas tank. Those are vapors. Those are volatile organic vapors, okay? So you can see them in petroleum hydrocarbons. You can see them in chlorinated solvents, such as dry cleaners, printing facilities, machine shops, anybody that's using these degreasers. These are all volatile products that off gas, and the nature of them is they don't necessarily follow topography. They're following a path of least resistance. They want to escape, okay? So they're going to find utility penetrations, cracks in concrete slabs. They're going to find a way, and if they can't find a way, they get trapped. So it's not uncommon that we'll see elevated concentrations or elevated accumulations of vapors underneath existing structures, which makes evaluating phase 1 ESAs in a downtown setting all the more challenging to understand where the sources are, and is there an ability to have that trapped vapors underneath structures. It makes us look sideways when something in our historical mind says, oh, that's down gradient. I don't have to worry about that. Where there may be utilities coming from that downslope site that are bringing those vapors. They're migrating up, they're hitting the utility conduit, and they're following it in theory uphill. You know, they're going to follow that path of least resistance. So these are some of the things that we're really starting to pay attention to. The lenders are looking at it, the EPA is looking at it, and trying to protect ourselves. So there's different forms of soil gas investigations. So we do a phase 1 ESA, we identify some sources that we're concerned with. So aside from your traditional soil sampling where you know you have a source, groundwater sampling where you kind of just want to get a snapshot, soil gases, we look at it a couple different ways. We want to look at if there's a source on the property or near a property line. We may evaluate near slab, meaning exterior, or drilling right below the slab. We'll drill holes in the concrete and we'll put in some vapor sampling points right beneath the slab to see if there's any vapor accumulating underneath that slab. The next thing would be, you know, kind of as a last resort, you don't want to jump right into indoor air quality testing. If your office is just like ECS's, you know, it's a typical office. You have copy rooms, production rooms, every product in that. You have cleaning supplies, you've got copier inks, you've got a variety of things in people's offices that may off gas. It could be the carpeting itself if it's brand new. So we try to recommend a stepped approach. That's where the regulators like to see is, first of all, do I have the potential for vapor intrusion? Is there a source? And this is all without doing any sampling. Yes, okay, check that box. The next step is maybe it's an offsite source. Maybe we're just going to do some vapor sampling around the perimeter of the property. We're not going to get the existing tenants nervous about what we're doing, drilling next to their building. We're going to drill along that property line and maybe we find some contaminants. Okay, well, maybe then we need to step it up a bit and get closer to the building. Get closer to the building. If it's there, then we consider going inside. A utility room, a space, a nondescript space where we won't necessarily have to rip up carpets, what have you. And we collect samples. Here are some of the products that we use. This would be considered a Suma canister. We call them cannonballs. They're kind of fun. These are under negative vacuum. So, and this is laboratory grade helium. This is more for QA/QC on our sample train. But this is what a sampling device will look like. One form of volatile organic screen for soil gas. Here's another example of a sample train. We've got a smaller SUMA canister and various gauges, QA/QC syringes to purge out background noise, background air in the system. And then we'll drill a hole. We'll insert the vapor plant in there, the tubing in below this concrete slab. We'll have a meter in here that's detecting helium. We'll flood that shroud with helium to make sure that if we detect it, we have a bad seal, okay? And if we don't detect it, we can go ahead and proceed with our test. Here's an outside example of the same thing. So we're gonna go ahead and collect those samples. And when we open up those SUMA canisters, like I said, they're under negative pressure. It's gonna automatically wanna inhale, and it's going to inhale that gas until it's full. And we'll ship that off to analysis to an independent laboratory for analysis for volatile organic compounds, just like we do with soil, just like we do with groundwater. Okay, we get the results back from the lab, and we are going, every state's a little bit different on how they interpret. The various EPA regions have their own interpretation, and then at the state level also we'll evaluate the risk posed by the contaminants that are identified in the sample. Okay, so this is, you'll see if you've done any level of phase 2 environmental assessments in your career, you'll know that the report talks about, we collected these samples, we analyzed it for these methods, and we compared it to these standards, okay? Based on the results, how do we deal with vapor intrusion? Like anything, there's always a solution. It's just a matter of, is it cost prohibitive? There's two general ways we do it is we create a barrier, okay? This is an example of a spray applied product. It's almost an asphalt-like material where they spray it on. This is after the subgrade goes down. You'll see all these utility penetrations coming up, plumbing, electrical conduits, etc. They'll seal it down with this spray applied barrier. They'll also do a thick poly sheeting, making sure to tape down all the sides and the seams to make sure there's no leakage. Often after they apply these products, they'll run what's called a smoke test. They'll pump smoke underneath the slab to see if there's any leaks, because that'd be an indication that obviously vapors could also escape as well. Okay, so that would be a vapor barrier. Not to be mistaken with what's in our crawl spaces underneath our homes. Those are moisture barriers. There's a critical difference. They're not intended to the moisture barriers underneath our structures are there to keep moisture levels down, mold growing on our floor joists, and increasing humidity in our crawl spaces. So they are, the idea is kind of sort of the same, but the mechanism is different and more engineered on the barrier setup. Sub-slab depressurization. This is a setup where you're literally having a system where you're pulling the vapors through a vacuum or through passive means. Those vapors get trapped underneath the slab. You're going to want to vent that through the roof. Okay, so you're going to run horizontal pipes, if you can, or vertical pipes in an existing structure beneath the slab. And you're going to run that pipe out either exterior, as shown in this image, or through a wall chase inside a structure. And you're going to put like a whirligig or or some sort of vacuum pump on the roof. Okay, you're going to pull those vapors from accumulating underneath the slab, and you're going to let them vent above the roof. Okay, you're going to get them out of there. So here's an example of that whirligig on top of the roof. You've probably seen them before. And when the wind blows, it helps. That pressure differential will help move those vapors on out. Okay, and I talked a little bit about this, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through there, and by all means, stop me if there's questions. So again, phase 2 contamination assessments, typically they're guided by what we find in a phase 1. It's not uncommon that I get asked the question, John, I need a price for phase 1 and phase 2. Tell me what you know, right? I can give you a phase 1 price every day right now. But if you are asking for a phase 2, that tells me you know something about the property. You're concerned about a source. You're concerned about an adjoining property. Now, we can get you pricing on a phase 2, a scope of work developed fairly quickly, but it will take some knowledge of the property. We can do that before the phase 1's completed, or based on historical knowledges that you may know as commercial real estate agents. So typically we're looking for the typical sources, underground tanks as illustrated here, printing facilities, dry cleaners, other heavy industry, generators of other forms of hazardous waste. So again, phase 2 ESAs, we're collecting a variety of samples. It could be one soil sample, it could be 10 groundwater and some soil gas. It's so highly variable. So when people ask me, sight unseen, give me a price for a phase 2, if I don't know anything, I'm going to say it's going to be between 500 and 50,000. That's not real helpful for you guys. So we need to kind of narrow it down. I would say in the industry standard, if you're looking at 5 to 10 borings, collecting a variety of samples for a variety of analytical parameters, you're probably in that $5,000 to $15,000. And that is highly variable depending on geologic conditions, site access issues and constraints, depending on the type of equipment you may need to gather that data. Okay, I just talked a little bit about the costs and what some of the drivers. Contrary to popular belief, the consultants, a lot of the costs in a phase 2 is really driven by our subs. There are firms out there that have these services in-house, but a lot of consultants like ECS will hire specialists, drillers, certified laboratories to analyze our samples. And of course, time is of the essence, right? So if you allow standard turnaround, standard scheduling, then you'll see typical pricing. If you have to get something done, maybe there was a delay and suddenly there's a rush to meet closing deadlines, we have to rush samples. The lab is asked to rush, the lab will charge you for that rush, and that's all passed along to the end user. So obviously, if there's ways we can call in capital to help minimize that impact, we certainly can. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the types of products that we're looking at, the types of facilities we're looking at, but this is an example of a geoprobe drill rig advancing borings into the subsurface. You can see in the background a canopy. What you would see, you don't see any dispensers, so this is likely a scenario where this was a former service, a filling station of some sort, and they're probably evaluating for petroleum hydrocarbons. Okay, phase 3, remedial action. This is where we're actually cleaning something up, right? So there may be a regulatory reason why we're having to clean something up. There may be a business reason. Maybe there's unsuitable soils for a construction site that have to be cut out anyway so you could build your building. Well, if they're contaminated, they have to go to a special disposal facility. They have to be managed properly. So we'll do it in those. Those are typically the drivers. There's also long-term maintenance of treatment systems if their contaminants are really severe. So there'll be some costs associated with pilot testing and delineation of the contaminant plume, followed by corrective action. What we're seeing a lot now, and it's not necessarily spotlighted here in this presentation, is brownfields. Certainly in North Carolina, it's a very beneficial program. It creates tax incentives, liability protections, and really minimizes the remedial side of contaminants known to be on properties. So another viable angle to what could be considered remedial action. And again, what do we do in the environmental side of ECS? Here's just a host of the different things. Many of them are applicable at the early stages in the due diligence phase for commercial real estate. Phase 1s, phase 2s, wetland studies, asbestos, lead-based paint, things of that nature. One of the business development directors that I've had the pleasure to work with here at ECS came from the commercial real estate industry. And one thing I learned from him, you're out there to protect your client's interests, especially if you're representing them as a buyer. Certainly we'd love to be on your team, but whoever that is, get a proposal, have it in your file, make your recommendation to your client to do their due diligence, to get that proposal in front of them. Most clients don't charge you to get a proposal. Get it in your folder, advise your client appropriately, and they're gonna have to make some business decisions on their own. I've been in the industry a long time. I wouldn't buy a piece of commercial real estate without a due diligence doing my phase 1 ESA. And there you go. Questions? And I'm gonna, so Brian and I, so you can see Brian and I both together. I'm gonna put up my social distance here. Bear with me. Keep my mask on. So,
Brian, I saw you had a question about the vapor. Do you want to ask that now, or did he answer it in his explanation? Unmute. Hey, Peter, can you unmute Brian? There you go.
He answered it. Thanks.
yeah,
Okay.
you got it.
I've got a question, John. You've talked about COVID-19 and how that's affected us this year in particular, and you've also talked about vapor evaluation and remediation as being one of the more, the newer technologies that you're using. What do you see as future environmental considerations that are on the horizon that you can talk with us about today that we might want to keep in mind?
That's a great question, Tim. You know, and we're you know, the vapor intrusion is still prevalent in the marketplace. So that still continues to evolve. The whole industry is evolving. Obviously, COVID, as Brian said, it changes almost daily, right? So there's lots of different things that we're looking at. One of the things that you may have heard of are called the emerging contaminants, okay? These are the forever chemicals. Having spent the last 12 years in the Wilmington, North Carolina marketplace, we were the downstream of a lot of heavy industry, and our water supply was threatened with these emerging contaminants. PFAS is a term that you may have heard in the industries. They're called forever chemicals. These are the chemicals that were designed, and one of the benefits of the products is it makes your kitchen skillets non-stick. It makes your outdoor weather gear waterproof, right? There's a lot of beneficial sides to them, but like many things, there's cons to those. And right now, the EPA is evaluating these contaminants and whether to characterize them as hazardous materials. If that's the case, that's going to be a game changer as we move forward, certainly potentially. I mean, that puts many sites that otherwise would be clean in current standards as potentially needing a look at for these emerging contaminants. Right now, there are no standards. There is no regulatory guidance on them other than we're all trying to figure it out. One added nuance, I talk about the cons of these materials, just the sampling of that material for these analytical, these constituents takes specialized training because the sampling equipment we use may actually contain the contaminants we're looking for. So it's really, the industry is really kind of scratching their head and trying to figure some things out. That is certainly one thing. ECS has members on the ASTM Phase 1 ESA committee that are constantly looking and evaluating what's going to be new in the new standard, and PFAS and emerging contaminants are certainly one of them. That's just name. I mean, that's just name one that really stands out to me. And I think we just have to be, just like vapor now is like, well, we didn't have to deal with that before. Well, we're going to have that continuing on in the future with different things.
And you said in 2021 is when the new Phase 1 standards will be coming out?
That is correct. And, you know, like we did in 13, we're going to already have an idea of what those changes are. And our job in the industry is to meet with groups like this to get out there and share what's new. What do I need to be thinking about? What do I need to be educating my client about? So we can make sure that our due diligence goes smoothly.
Any other questions been submitted, Peter, that you can share?
Tim, I have one more question.
Okay. Good,
John, somewhere in the report it said vapor intrusions not required right now. Is that what was the?
Well, there's a difference between in a Phase 1 ESA, contaminants, including vapors, need to be considered for potential as a potential recognized environmental condition. Now, there's also a vapor encroachment standard, which is a completely different ASTM standard that specifically looks at, and it looks at it from a very similar aspect. It's looking at sources, it's looking at distances, it's looking at distances from offsite sources, it's looking at similar regulatory databases, but it's fundamentally a different standard. So yes, if a phase 1 ESA, if you got one done today and it said there's no recognized environmental conditions, that the expectation is that the consultant has evaluated the site for impact from soil, to groundwater, to soil gas and potential vapor intrusion. So that's part of the ASTM standard. It's a little bit of a gray nuance in there, whether you've done the vapor encroachment or vapor intrusion standard, which is a little bit different, which we can talk about in the future if you'd like. We could talk about that standard too.
All right, well, John and Brian, thank you so much. What an excellent presentation. I know that we're going to be sharing this with the rest of the members that weren't able to be with us live, but excellent presentation, and one that we'll be able to refer back to and use. And thanks so much for your time. Once again, thanks for your sponsorship of RCA and of the CCIM program here in North Carolina. And thanks so much for the time invested in putting this program together for us. I would tell everyone that's listening in that next month we'll be having a meeting on the 27th of October, and that will be the 4 triad mayors: Burlington, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point will be joining in. This should be a meeting between the Burlington, High Point, Greensboro, and Winston-Salem RCA groups. All will be invited to participate in a virtual meeting. So I'm sure this being an election year, and with all the things happening, the challenges involved with an election year and COVID-19 and other things that have impacted us this year, that will be a very interesting meeting. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, thanks, guys.